There's a kind of mythology which surrounds the role of talk in learning, one which represents it as something comparatively new. It situates it as a product of contemporary progressivism, a backlash against Victorian educational traditions of drill and rote, and the consequent production of overly disciplined, receptive, but uncritical learners. There is certainly a recent association between dialogue in classrooms and an intent to foster autonomy and empowerment in the individual. The implication that discussion is a recent addition to our theories of learning is, however, erroneous, as is the tendency among some political camps to dismiss dialogic pedagogies as newfangled. I would suggest that an appreciation of the value of talk in learning is much, much older than we would initially assume, even if its serious integration into state education has only more recently taken hold. The notion can be found in some of the earliest theories of learning and teaching. It is at least 2,500 years old. The educational practice of the Greek philosopher Socrates centred on notions of dialogue. His principles began with a rejection of information giving as a basis for teaching, whether in interpersonal contexts or in the form of a lecture. Socrates saw questions as infinitely more important than answers, and the role of the teacher to be one of skillful asking. His intent was never to lead the learner to a particular fixed endpoint, to close down exploration. Rather, Socrates saw questions as a means of opening up unending possibilities for understanding of the world, as methods of levering tensions and contradictions in the learner's thinking. The idea of Socratic method remains live in contemporary languages of pedagogy, where it describes the sense of questioning to extend thinking rather than simply to assess it. A similarly pedagogic framing of talk was invested in early learning theory, particularly in that associated with Lev Vygotsky. Vygotskyan theory is rich, vibrant, and intricately articulated. It's much more complex than the common reduction of it to the zone of proximal development. Language, and by extension talk, is fundamental to that theory. Vygotsky suggests that the meanings which language avails to us are more than just neutral carriers of information. They're more than ways of just representing the content of our thinking. Rather, language encodes culture, and the ways in which that culture imposes categories on the world. It is through these categories that we organise our reality into something meaningful. In Vygotskyan terms, they are our tools of intellectual adaptation. In short, the semantic structure of language, the words and concepts we have available to us, is more than just a reflection of an external objective reality. Rather, it represents the cultural achievement of constructing that reality by imposing shared meanings on experiences. Such a stance begs language-rich learning environments, and talk offers an immediacy of contact with that language, a fluid medium through which to exchange and experiment with meanings. There's a tendency to read a deterministic strand running through Vygotsky, that the language available to us programs how we think. This reading is often implied by a common habit in translation of Vygotsky to refer to the internalization of cultural frameworks embodied in language, something which implies a passive process of filling up the individual with ways of thinking. This has influenced the formation of theories of linguistic determinism and relativism, most famously the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which holds that different cultures interpret the world in different ways using the nuances that their language gives them. Applied to the classroom, this might suggest that more sophisticated, or even better, use of language leads to more sophisticated thought. Or, in a slightly softer version, more sophisticated communication of that thought. Of course, such a stance begs the question of who decides what counts as sophisticated or better language. It also misses some of the nuance of Vygotsky's perspective, and an appreciation of this nuance can help to further appreciate talk in classrooms. In his later work at the Moscow Institute of Psychology, Vygotsky collaborated with others such as Luria and Leontiev to lay the foundations of a broad perspective called activity theory. At the centre of this approach is a fundamental concern with the ways in which human beings use tools in order to achieve particular objectives. This proposition is obvious in relation to physical tools. We pick up a spade, for instance, as a way of augmenting our innate capabilities in the activity of digging a great big hole. The Moscow School extends this way of thinking about human activity into the semiotic realm. In other words, they suggest that languages and the meanings they embody are also a kind of tool. Like their physical counterparts, we draw on them in order to achieve particular purposes and activities which we would not otherwise achieve, to invest a set of experiences with meaning. The ability to understand the world scientifically from this perspective involves drawing on particular ways of talking about it, a vocabulary, and a set of logics which are defined by the relationships which exist amongst that vocabulary. Fundamentally here, the individual remains active as a tool user, and their free will is wrapped up in these tools. It's both enabled by their capacity to extend innate capacities and creativities, and constrained by the limits of what tools are available and the purposes that they can be set to. As such, Vygotsky's process may begin with internalizing meaning, but it ends with the capacity to deploy those meanings autonomously towards one's own ends. Mikhail Bakhtin, a contemporary of Vygotsky, similarly talks about the appropriation of meaning by the individual. He suggests that all ways of understanding and thinking and talking about the world begin as words spoken by others, which are gradually turned to the individual's own purposes and intents, with increasing degrees of mastery and ownership. Between them, these theorists construct a relationship with language which is more fluid and interactive than a strictly determinist stance. They also bring with them different implications for classroom practice, calling for a site in which experimentation with language enables stronger mastery over meaning. Over 2 millennia, a theoretical context has therefore developed around language and learning. And in recent years, the work of Robin Alexander and Neil Mercer has achieved much in bringing a synthesis of these ideas and making a case for their importance in contemporary education. The work of Alexander and Mercer has strong parallels, only really diverging in focus. Whilst the former focuses on interactions between teachers and pupils, the latter is concerned with talk among students. Alexander and Mercer draw on empirical data from classroom observation in order to identify forms of talk which are more or less productive in facilitating learning. In the latter category, they identify interaction patterns which tend towards convergence, on the closing down of possibilities to particular answers, or of overt disagreement in which various camps retreat to their own perspectives with little in the way of disruption or exploration. Alexander, in particular, exposes a trap of playing hunt the answer, a tendency to follow an interactional pattern of initiation, response, and feedback, by which the teacher attempts to elicit in students a particular set of answers he or she holds in his or her head. This is an interactional pattern which is culturally prevalent, and which is reinforced by a range of contextual factors, not least a curriculum and an accountability structure with an emphasis on prescribed outcomes. But regardless, it is, according to Alexander, not conducive to effective learning. In a perspective reminiscent of Socrates, and which draws significance when set amongst the principles of the Soviet school of theory, Mercer and Alexander suggest that more productive talk, that which is dialogic or exploratory, is characterized by an open-endedness. It's one in which participants actively co-construct meaning, by attending to the detail of arguments, without an overwhelming concern with reaching a given endpoint, and in doing so to master the particular language-embedded logics of their domains of study. The dialogic turn in learning theory is, then, one which draws deep and long-established roots. But its recent reinvention is one which I would argue is significant in disrupting some of the standing conventions which exist around thinking and practice. I would suggest 3 distinct dimensions in the significance of these implications. Firstly, a dialogic emphasis in pedagogy is one which may realise increased effectiveness, directly enriching some well-maintained existing principles. If we are to hold with the constructivist stance that better learning occurs where learners are allowed to construct their own understandings rather than receiving them by rote, then the dialogic emphasis on experimentation and exploration of meaning through talk seems cogent. Secondly, the perspective casts learners as active and empowered co-constructors of understanding. This has ethical undertones, and a commitment to disrupt conventional power relationships in the classroom, which mirrors some of the work on critical pedagogy of people like Paulo Freire and Michael Apple. Finally, dialogic perspectives on learning offer a provocative theoretical disruption. It challenges the assumption of learning as an atomized, individualized event which occurs within the individual. It instead situates thought and understanding as something which emerges in the spaces in between individuals, when they are allowed to engage in open and supported exploratory dialogue. In this sense, a seemingly contained set of teaching practices bring with them implications which productively trouble some of our core assumptions in Western educational practice.